The boarding process had begun like countless flights before it. The narrow jet bridge echoed with the shuffle of feet and the rolling of carry-ons as passengers and boarding group one filed into the cabin. Businessmen with briefcases, vacationing, families wrangling strollers, and solo travelers with headphones already in place trickled down the aisle in practiced routine. The smell of recirculated air mixed with coffee from the galley and the faint tang of fuel lingering from the tarmac. Below, seat numbers glowed faintly above the rows as people slowed, stowing bags into overhead bins, offering polite excuse-mes and squeezing past one another. The flight attendants welcomed each with the same steady rhythm of practiced smiles and nods. To anyone watching, it was just another flight, a routine crossing of states on a weekday afternoon. Amid this flow of passengers, a woman appeared, moving with a calm deliberateness. She wasn't in a rush, nor did she look distracted like so many others juggling phones and boarding passes. She carried only one small leather bag, worn at the edges, with a faintly embossed insignia on the corner that no one noticed. Dressed in simple slacks and a light jacket, she could have been mistaken for a teacher heading to a conference, or perhaps a mother traveling to visit grown children. Her steps were steady, her eyes scanning the cabin once as if she were assessing something unseen before she quietly made her way down the aisle. Her ticket directed her to the window seat in row 13, seat F. A middle-aged man in a business suit already sat in the aisle seat, scrolling through his phone. He offered her a quick, polite smile and shifted his knees to the side so she could slide past him. She returned the gesture with a small nod, placing her leather bag beneath the seat before settling in. From a distance, there was nothing remarkable about her. She looked like anyone else mid-40s, hair tied back neatly, face composed but not severe. Yet there was a composure in her posture that set her apart. While others adjusted headrests, dug for headphones, or tugged at jackets, she sat with her back straight, hands folded lightly in her lap, gaze directed toward the window. She exuded a kind of stillness rare in crowded spaces, a stillness that came not from passivity, but from control. The boarding continued. A young mother struggled with two children, one clutching a stuffed dinosaur and the other whining about the lack of Wi-Fi. A college student dropped his backpack onto his neighbor's foot, mumbling apologies. An elderly couple shuffled down the aisle together, clutching matching neck pillows. Life filled the cabin in all its noisy variety. But in seat 13F, the woman seemed like an anchor amid the bustle, unaffected by the rising chaos of settling passengers. The businessman beside her noticed. He glanced at her discreetly, sensing something unusual but unable to place it. There was nothing outwardly intimidating about her, no sharpness in her features, no coldness in her demeanor. If anything, she looked approachable, calm. Yet something in the way she sat, the way her eyes scanned the cabin once more before returning to the window, gave him the impression of someone who saw more than she let on. He dismissed it after a moment, returning to his phone. When the last passengers finally boarded, the attendants closed the overhead bins with firm clicks. The plane filled with the mechanical hum of systems powering, the occasional metallic creak of the fuselage shifting as ground crew prepared for pushback. A flight attendant gave the safety briefing, gestures crisp, voice steady. Most passengers ignored it, already lost in screens, books, or conversations. The woman in 13F, however, watched attentively, following each motion as though rehearsing it silently in her mind. The engines spooled up with a rising whine, and the plane rolled slowly away from the gate. Out the window, service trucks and luggage carts receded into the distance. The taxi to the runway took several minutes, a familiar ritual to seasoned travelers, but still filled with small moments of tension for others. Children pressed their noses to the glass, trying to glimpse other planes waiting in line. The woman in 13F leaned slightly, her gaze not on the ground crew or the airport buildings, but further toward the sky beyond. Takeoff came with the rush of acceleration, a collective tightening of grips on armrests, followed by the brief weightlessness as wheels left the earth. The cabin tilted, engines roaring, before leveling into a steady climb. Passengers relaxed, conversations resumed, seatbelt signs eventually clicked off. The plane settled into cruise, 30,000 feet above the ground. It was then that the differences in passengers became more noticeable. The businessman beside her ordered a drink, loosening his tie. The children across the aisle had already scattered crayons across their tray table. The college students snored faintly. Everyone seemed to melt into their routines of distraction and comfort. But the woman in 13F remained alert. Her hands rested lightly on the armrests, not tense but ready, her posture still upright. Her eyes scanned the horizon through the window, not just admiring clouds or sunlit streaks in the distance, but searching with intent. There was familiarity in her gaze. As though she wasn't just looking at scenery, she was evaluating, calculating, remembering. A flight attendant paused by her row, offering water. She accepted with a polite nod, speaking little. Her voice was calm, even, with a clarity that carried more authority than volume. The attendant moved on, but for a brief moment she had the sense she'd served someone accustomed to command. Around her, the world moved in ordinary rhythms. A baby cried somewhere near the back. A man argued quietly with his partner over the in-flight Wi-Fi. The smell of reheated meals drifted faintly from the galley. Life continued as always. Yet beneath it all, in seat 13F, there was an undercurrent of something else, something that didn't belong to the ordinary. The businessman tried once more to make small talk. "Do you fly often?" he asked, adjusting his cufflinks. The woman turned to him, offering a faint smile. "I've flown enough," she replied simply, her tone giving nothing away. He chuckled awkwardly, expecting more, but she returned her attention to the window, ending the exchange with quiet finality. Time passed. The engines droned steadily. Passengers dozed, watched movies, or flipped through magazines. The woman in 13F remained awake, her eyes occasionally closing, but never fully resting. She wasn't restless, just present, anchored, like someone who could switch into action at a moment's notice if called. From the outside, she was only a passenger, among many, indistinguishable in the anonymity of airline travel. But for those who paid attention, there was something different, something in the way she carried herself, the way she sat not as a passenger, but as if she were still, in some way, on duty. The mystery lingered like an unspoken secret in the air, because though no one on that flight knew it yet, the woman in seat 13F had once lived in skies far different from these. She had worn a helmet, not a headset. She had gripped controls that could turn the tide of battles. And though she had stepped away years ago, the skies had not forgotten her. The passengers around her saw only an ordinary traveler, but the sky itself would soon recognize her again. The plane had been cruising smoothly for nearly an hour. The sun painted soft amber streaks across the horizon, reflecting in shifting patterns on the wing outside. The atmosphere inside the cabin had settled into the familiar rhythm of mid-flight. Passengers flipping through movies, attendants wheeling carts down the aisle, occasional laughter breaking from conversations. Then the intercom crackled. The captain's voice came steady, but carried an unusual note of formality. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been notified of scheduled military training operations in this airspace. For the next portion of our flight, we'll be joined briefly by 2 United States Air Force F-22 Raptors, who will escort us through their exercise zone. There's no cause for concern, this is routine. But if you look out your windows, you may just get a rare view." The announcement rippled through the cabin like a sudden current. Heads lifted from magazines, screens paused mid-movie, window. Shades flicked up. A few startled passengers exchanged nervous looks, but most reacted with excitement. Phones were lifted, cameras readied. Children pressed eagerly against the glass, waiting to catch a glimpse of the famous fighter jets they'd only seen in movies. The businessman in the aisle seat next to 13F gave a low whistle. F-22s, huh? That's something you don't see every day. He adjusted in his seat, craning his neck to peer past her toward the clouds. The woman in 13F leaned to the window, but not with the jittery thrill of the others. Her face remained calm, her expression unreadable. Where the passengers saw novelty, she seemed to see recognition, as though she were reacquainting herself with something familiar. Her eyes searched the sky, patient, almost expectant. Minutes passed, and then, faint at first, came the glint of metal against sunlight. Gasps erupted across the cabin as two sleek silhouettes cut through the sky, closing the distance with graceful precision. The F-22s drew closer until their angular forms were unmistakable predatory lines and sharp wings glistening like steel predators against the clouds. Children squealed. Adults scrambled for photos. The college student who had slept through most of the flight jerked awake, fumbling for his phone. The elderly couple across the aisle clasped hands, eyes wide with awe. Even the flight attendants slowed their service to glance out the windows. "Look at that!" someone shouted from the back. The Raptors flew in tight formation, parallel to the airliner, their presence commanding even at a respectful distance. They were silent inside the cabin, but their aura was felt an unmistakable reminder of power, speed, and the guardianship of the skies. The businessman beside her chuckled nervously. "They're like hawks circling us. Makes you feel, I don't know, small." The woman in 13F didn't respond. Her gaze was fixed on the jet to the right, studying its movements. Her lips pressed together, not in fear, but in calculation. She noticed the slight dip of its nose as it adjusted to the airliner's speed, the seamless coordination with its partner. Details others admired as spectacle, she absorbed as assessment, like a teacher grading a student's precision. Around her, passengers gawked and grinned. Some snapped blurry photos through scratched windows. Others leaned across strangers for a better view. But to her, it wasn't about the novelty of seeing Raptors. It was about the language of flight angles, spacing, trust between machines and the pilots guiding them. A child's voice rang out across the row. "Wow, they're like superheroes. Are they here to protect us?" Laughter answered him, but the woman's eyes softened briefly at the innocence of the question. She had once been the answer to it. The businessman tried again, lowering his voice as though inviting her into camaraderie. "You don't look impressed. First time seeing these things this close?" Her eyes stayed on the window. "Not the first," she replied simply. He blinked, surprised, but before he could ask more, the Raptor closest to their side edged slightly forward, banking with the grace of a hawk catching a thermal. It leveled again, its canopy glinting bright under the sun. For a fleeting second, the silhouette of the pilot inside was visible, a dark figure within the bubble of glass. Inside that cockpit, the pilot scanned his instruments, then the airliner alongside. His eyes tracked rows of windows and curious faces until they locked, unknowingly, onto seat 13F. And inside the cabin, the woman's gaze locked back. She did. Not wave or grin like the other passengers. She simply looked steady and measured, as though acknowledging, not greeting, not marveling. The kind of look that carries weight without words. The pilot tilted his head slightly, frowning beneath his helmet. Something about the figure at 13F, the composure, the stillness stood out. She wasn't just another passenger waving with excitement. She was watching him the way pilots watch one another, with scrutiny, with recognition. In the cabin, chatter rose louder. Passengers compared photos, joked nervously about being escorted like VIPs, and pointed at the way the jets moved. Excitement filled the air, masking any trace of unease. But in 13F, the atmosphere was different. The woman's silence spoke volumes, though no one around her understood it. For her, the sight of Raptors wasn't just awe-inspiring, it was personal. She remembered their first test flights, the controversies, the training hours poured into perfecting maneuvers. She remembered standing on airfields as they screamed overhead, watching young pilots wrestle with their capabilities. She remembered the feeling of a jet vibrating beneath her hands, alive and deadly, when she herself had been at the controls. And now, here she was anonymous, one among hundreds watching them from behind a passenger window. It was a strange twist of fate. The businessman beside her chuckled nervously again. Well, I guess we're safe. Nobody's gonna mess with us now, huh? The woman turned slightly, her expression unreadable. They're not here for safety. They're here for precision. He didn't quite understand, but nodded anyway, turning back to his phone to capture another shaky photo. Out the window, the Raptors held their position effortlessly, wings slicing the air with disciplined grace. The passengers might have seen them as guardians, as marvels of modern engineering, but to the woman in 13F, they were something else. They were reminders of a life once lived, of skies once claimed, of a name once whispered over radios in the dead of night. And though no one else on that plane could possibly know it yet, the sight of those Raptors was not just a glimpse of the unexpected. It was the first sign that her past had found her again. The cabin had become a theater of awe. Dozens of faces pressed close to their oval windows, smartphones raised at awkward angles, flashes of reflection bouncing on the glass. Every passenger seemed determined to capture proof that this ordinary flight had transformed into something extraordinary. 2 F-22 Raptors flying in escort formation. It was the kind of story people would boast about for years. Excited chatter rippled through the rows. Can you believe this? One man muttered as he leaned across his seatmate to snap a photo. Children squealed, narrating every slight adjustment of the jet's wings as if they were commentators at an air show. Even passengers who had been asleep were now awake, drawn by the energy pulsing through the cabin. For most, the moment was spectacle. But in seat 13F, it was something else entirely. The woman's face remained calm, her posture unchanged, but her eyes told a different story. They didn't dance with the thrill of novelty, nor widen with fear. Instead, they steadied quiet, calculating, familiar. She was not watching as an outsider. She was watching as someone who knew the stakes, the weight of each maneuver, the intent behind even the smallest shift of angle. Her lips parted, slightly, almost unconsciously, and a single word slipped out so softly it seemed intended only for herself. Raven. It was less a word than a memory breathed aloud. The syllables hung in the air, for only an instant, fragile and fleeting. But fate has a way of catching fragile things, amplifying them, sending them further than intended. In the seat across the aisle, a boy of no more than 8 heard it. He was a wiry child with freckles and restless energy, pressed so close to the window that his breath fogged the glass. He turned his head quickly toward her. "Raven?" he asked, his voice carrying further than hers had. "What's Raven?" The businessman beside her looked up from his phone, eyebrows lifting. A couple of nearby passengers turned their heads as well. Curiosity piqued. The woman blinked, realizing too late that she'd spoken aloud. Her gaze softened at the boy, but she didn't answer. The boy's mother, trying to keep him from disturbing strangers, reached across and hushed him. "Don't bother the lady, sweetie," but the word was out now. Passengers who had caught it exchanged puzzled glances. A flight attendant passing by with a tray of drinks paused, her practiced smile warm. "Is that your nickname?" she asked lightly, leaning toward the woman in 13F. "Raven? That's kind of cool." The woman gave a polite smile, shaking her head faintly. "Just a word," she said softly. But her denial did not erase the curiosity. Words, once spoken, have a way of lingering. And this one lingered longer than most. The boy repeated it again, louder this time, his voice filled with the innocent excitement only a child can summon. "Raven." He grinned as if he'd discovered a secret code. His voice carried several rows back. Passengers chuckled. A few muttered to one another, wondering what it meant. The woman folded her hands in her lap, her composure unshaken. Yet beneath her calm, there was a flicker of something regret. Perhaps, or inevitability. She hadn't meant for the name to surface. It belonged to another time, another life, a version of herself she had long since left behind. But names have power. And this one, whispered carelessly, had found ears beyond. The cabin. Because outside, beyond the glass where the sunlight gleamed on angular wings, radios crackled. In the cockpit of the lead F-22, the pilot adjusted his helmet, eyes narrowing as his audio feed carried the faintest trace of chatter from the airliner. Passenger cabin mics weren't meant to reach them, but sometimes stray sounds slipped through the murmur of crew conversations, the occasional laugh when frequencies overlapped. It was usually meaningless. But this? The pilot froze as the word registered. Raven. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it. But then his wingman's voice came, sharp over the comms. "Did you hear that?" The lead swallowed hard. "Yeah, I heard it." There was silence for a beat, the kind of silence that carries weight. Then quietly, almost reverently, the wingman asked, "Do you think it's her?" The lead didn't answer right away. His eyes scanned the row of windows, moving over. The sea of curious faces staring back at him. It was impossible to see clearly from this distance, but something in his gut told him the truth he hadn't yet spoken. Inside the airliner, the passengers carried on, unaware of the stir their neighbor's whisper had caused. The boy had lost interest, now giggling as he tried to photograph the jet through his mother's phone. The businessman shrugged, dismissing Raven as some odd personal quirk. Life in the cabin resumed its rhythm. But the woman in 13F sat still, her gaze steady on the jet beside them. She knew. She didn't need confirmation from instruments or radio chatter. She could feel it, the ripple that one word had sent through the sky. It was a call sign, not a name. And call signs carry weight in the world of aviators. They are not chosen lightly. They are earned in the air, forged in missions, spoken with respect. Raven was not just a nickname. It was history, whispered across cockpits, etched into training manuals, still remembered long after the woman herself had stepped away. And now it had returned, unbidden, in the presence of those who still carried its memory. The boy beside her tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why did she say Raven? Is she a superhero?" His mother chuckled and hushed him again, but the question lingered in the air like smoke. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the window, her reflection faint in the glass, eyes meeting the canopy of the jet beside her. Somewhere, inside, a pilot stared back, and though neither could hear the other, both knew the same thing. This was no coincidence. The name Raven had been spoken, and the skies had listened. The word had been spoken. A single syllable, no louder than a breath, had reached ears it was never meant to find. Yet now it echoed across frequencies and filled two cockpits with something heavier than sound. Memory. Raven? The wingman's voice came sharp, disbelieving, almost reverent. "You heard it too?" The lead pilot kept his eyes locked on the airliner, his grip tightening on the stick. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I heard it." For a long moment, silence pressed between them, broken only by the steady hum of their engines. Both men had trained for years, drilled through simulations and manuals. But there were legends in their world that went beyond procedure. Legends spoken of in classrooms, over late-night beers, and whispered in the ready room before dangerous missions. Raven was one of them. The lead pilot finally spoke again. "It can't be." She retired. "Disappeared," they said. "Disappeared," the wingman echoed. "Or walked away. Doesn't mean she's gone." They both fell silent again, but their eyes told the story. The possibility was impossible, and yet the idea sparked in their chests like a live wire. Inside the cabin of the airliner, oblivious passengers leaned and laughed, still marveling at the rare company of fighter jets. Some waved toward the Raptors, delighted when one tilted ever so slightly in acknowledgement. Children clapped. Cameras clicked. The cabin was alive with the thrill of novelty. But in seat 13F, there was no thrill. There was only inevitability. The woman sat still, her hands folded lightly, her expression composed. But behind her calm exterior, she could feel the shift outside. Pilots have instincts that don't fade, even after years away. She could sense it in the way the lead Raptor edged closer than protocol required, the way its canopy angled just slightly toward her row of windows. They were looking for her. She had spent years avoiding moments like this, years of blending into crowds, of quiet routines and anonymous travel. She had shed her uniform, her call sign, her legacy. To the world, she was simply Elena Cortez, an ordinary woman with no fanfare. But to the skies, she would always be Raven. The businessman in the aisle seat noticed the Raptor shift and frowned. "That's closer than before, isn't it?" he asked, his voice edged with nervous humor. "Feels like they're staring at us." The woman gave no answer. Her gaze met the jet outside with a steadiness that carried history. She knew this dance recognition wasn't spoken through words. It was felt through angles, through presence, through a silence louder than applause. In the cockpit, the lead pilot's voice returned, softer this time. "Raven was before our time, but," he hesitated. "I've seen footage, heard the stories. She pulled maneuvers they still teach in sim. They said she could make an aircraft move like it had instincts of its own." The wingman laughed under his breath, but there was no mockery in it. "If she's in there, we're escorting a ghost story." The lead pilot adjusted his throttle slightly, holding position steady against the airliner's wing. His eyes searched row after row of windows until his gaze settled on a figure who didn't wave, didn't cheer, didn't even raise a phone. She only watched calm, unshaken, like someone who'd seen all of this before. "Row 13, he said quietly over the comm. "Window seat, you see her?" "I see her," the wingman confirmed. They both fell silent again. Inside the cabin, a ripple of unease began to mix with the excitement. Passengers noticed the way the Raptors weren't just flying, they were observing. Their formation tightened, not aggressively, but with unmistakable purpose. It was as if the jets weren't escorting the plane at all, but rather saluting it. A murmur spread across rows. Why are they so close? Do they know someone on this flight? Is something wrong? The boy who had repeated her whisper earlier tugged at his mother's sleeve again, his eyes bright. "Mom, I told." "You?" She said Raven, and now they're looking at her. His mother chuckled awkwardly, trying to hush him, but others overheard. Eyes began drifting toward row 13, subtle at first, then more direct. Passengers glanced, curious, at the quiet woman by the window. The businessman beside her shifted uncomfortably under the attention. What's going on?" he asked her in a low voice. "Why is everyone looking this way?" The woman remained still, her eyes never leaving the jet outside. Inside her chest, a familiar sensation stirred the weight of recognition, the pull of a past she had tried to leave behind. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. The lead pilot's voice came firm over the comms now. "Tower, this is Viper 1. Confirmed visual on possible Raven." The reply crackled back, incredulous. "Say again, Viper 1? Did you just say Raven?" "Affirmative," the lead pilot said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Passenger cabin, row 13, window seat, we believe." "It's her." Static filled the pause before the tower responded again, softer now. "Copy that, Viper 1. Proceed with discretion." Inside the airliner, oblivious passengers snapped more photos, thinking they were witnessing a routine exercise. But for those in the Raptor's cockpits, this was no routine. This was a reunion with history itself. The woman in 13F finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she raised a hand from her lap, not to wave like the others, but to rest her palm gently against the glass. A silent acknowledgement. The lead pilot saw it. His throat tightened. Without hesitation, he adjusted his angle, tipping the Raptor's wings ever so slightly, a subtle gesture, invisible to most passengers, but unmistakable to those who understood the language of the sky. A salute. The woman's eyes softened, though her expression remained composed. She inclined her head by the smallest fraction, a gesture few would notice, but one the pilot felt in his chest like a lightning strike. The wingman's voice cracked over the comms, filled with awe. "It's her. There's no doubt now. That's Raven." Inside the cabin, a child shouted in delight at the sudden wingtip dip, thinking it was a trick just for him. Passengers clapped, unaware of the deeper exchange unfolding before their eyes. The businessman beside her turned sharply, staring at her profile with dawning realization. "Wait," he whispered. You're somebody." But she didn't answer. Her silence said enough. Outside, two Raptors held formation tighter than ever, their presence no longer routine. They weren't just flying alongside a passenger plane anymore. They were honoring one of their own. Recognition had come, and the sky itself bowed in respect. The recognition had already begun outside the windows, whispered through radio channels and sealed in subtle gestures between fighter jets and one quiet passenger. But inside the cabin, the ripple was spreading, threading through the rows like a current. Passengers craned their necks toward row 13, some discreetly, others openly. A few snapped photos, pretending to capture the Raptors, but angling their phones toward the woman in 13F instead. She felt their stares, but her eyes never left the jets. The businessman beside her finally spoke what others were thinking. "You're not just a passenger, are you?" His voice was hushed, but the intensity behind it carried. She didn't answer. Silence had always been her shield. Meanwhile, at the front of the aircraft, the captain received a discreet transmission. Through his headset, his brow furrowed as he listened, his co-pilot watching him closely. "Say again?" The captain asked quietly. "Passenger where?" The tower's reply came steady. "Row 13. Possible identification as former major. Elena Cortez. Call sign, Raven." The captain leaned back in his seat, momentarily stunned. He wasn't a combat pilot. He ferried civilians across continents, but even in commercial aviation, legends like Raven reached the cockpit. She was the name that surfaced in training stories, the pilot whose split-second maneuvers had saved lives and rewrote playbooks. "Sir," the co-pilot said, eyes wide, "if that's really her." The captain exhaled slowly, pressing a hand over his mouth. "Then we're not just flying passengers today. We're carrying history." He toggled the intercom to the cabin crew. "Lead attendant, discreetly check on row 13. Seat F. Don't alarm her. Don't draw attention. Just confirm if she matches the name Elena Cortez. Moments later, the lead attendant, an elegant woman with 2 decades of experience, slipped quietly down the aisle. She'd managed crying infants, medical emergencies, even a midter proposal gone wrong. But nothing compared to this. She stopped by row 13 with a professional smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said softly. "Can I get you anything? Water? Tea?" The woman looked up, her gaze steady. For the briefest moment, recognition flickered in the attendant's eyes. A name she had heard once, years ago, snapped into place with the face before her. "No, thank you," the woman in 13F replied, her voice calm. The attendant nodded, her composure flawless, but inside she knew. She whispered into her concealed mic as she walked back up the aisle. "Captain, it's her. It's Raven." The captain closed his eyes for a second. Confirmation had arrived. Back in row 13, the boy who had first repeated her call sign leaned forward eagerly. "Are you really Raven?" he asked, not caring who heard. His voice rang clear in the curious hush of the cabin. Heads turned fully now. No more pretending. Passengers waited, breath held, for her response. The businessman's eyes darted between her and the boy. Raven? As in, the Raven? The woman finally tore her gaze from the jet outside. Her dark eyes swept the cabin, reading the faces tilted toward her. Curiosity, disbelief, reverence, it was all there. For years she had denied them that answer, had chosen the cloak of anonymity. But now, with the sky itself saluting her, silence no longer felt like an option. She straightened in her seat. "My name," she said quietly, but with a firmness that carried, "is Elena Cortez. They used to call me Raven." The cabin fell into a hush so complete it was startling. Even the constant hum of the engines seemed to fade. Someone near the back whispered, "It's her." Another whispered back, "I thought she was gone." The boy grinned so wide his face flushed. "I knew it." The businessman leaned back, running a hand over his jaw. Unbelievable. I'm sitting next to Raven. Her admission was not a boast. It was not even pride. It was acknowledgement, a thread tying her past to this moment. But for those who heard it, it was revelation. Whispers surged, questions bubbled, and admiration grew like a rising tide. Passengers leaned closer, wanting stories, wanting details. Who could resist? She was sitting among them, the woman whose name was spoken like myth. But Elena Cortez Raven did not launch into tales. Instead, she spoke sparingly, each word carrying weight. "I flew," she said when asked. "I served. That's all." Yet that wasn't all, and they knew it. Stories of her feats had circulated for years. The evasive role that saved her squadron when ambushed over hostile terrain. The impossible climb through a canyon where radar and missiles have locked her in. The escort missions that never lost a life on her watch. Each maneuver had become a line in training manuals. Each decision had shaped a generation of pilots. The captain's voice broke through the cabin intercom, unusually personal. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Normally, I'd be updating you on altitude and weather. But today, I'd like to share something extraordinary. Among us, seated quietly in row 13, is Major Elena Cortez. Call sign Raven. For those of you unfamiliar, she is one of the most respected aviators to ever wear the uniform of this country." Gasps rippled. Passengers turned fully now, some pressing hands to their mouths in disbelief. Others clapped spontaneously. Before stopping, unsure if applause was appropriate at 30,000 feet. The captain continued, his voice thick with emotion. "It's an honor, an absolute honor to have her on board." The intercom clicked off. Silence, Then a slow swell of applause rose from the rows. At first tentative, then louder, fuller. It spread down the cabin like wildfire, until every hand was clapping, every face turned toward 13F. Elena sat still, her expression composed but her chest tight. She had faced missiles, blackouts, and the razor's edge of mortality without flinching. But this wave of gratitude left her struggling for words. The boy leaned forward again, eyes shining. "What's it like?" he asked earnestly. "To fly like that?" She met his gaze, and for once, her voice softened into something personal. "It feels," she said, "like you and the sky are the only two things in the world. Nothing else matters. Just trust and freedom and responsibility, heavier than the plane itself." The boy's eyes widened, and he nodded, as if he understood something far beyond his years. The raptors outside maintained formation, close and reverent. Their pilots spoke in quiet tones, unable to tear their eyes away from the airliner's row 13. "Can you believe this?" One murmured, "She's right there, just sitting in coach." "Not just sitting," the other corrected. "Teaching even now." As the minutes passed, the cabin shifted. What began as curiosity had become respect. No one dared pester her with too many questions anymore. Instead, they watched in awe, aware they were in the presence of someone who had once commanded the very skies they were flying through. And for Elena Cortez, a truth settled in her chest. She had left her call sign behind, had sought peace and anonymity. But some legacies cannot be buried. They live on in stories, in whispered names, in the tilt of a wingtip against an endless blue canvas. For the first time in years, she did not fight it. She let it be. Outside, the raptors flew steady, guarding not a plane, but a legend returned to the sky. The sky held steady at 36,000 feet, its vastness painted in endless gradients of blue. Outside, the raptors remained in formation, their silver-gray wings gleaming like blades against the sunlight. They weren't merely escorting a civilian airliner. They were keeping vigilant honor guard for someone who had once guided them, even if from the pages of legend rather than a flight schedule. Inside the cabin, silence hung heavy after the applause had faded. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, unsure whether to return to their magazines and headphones or simply sit in reverent stillness. No one wanted to break the spell. The lead flight attendant stepped softly into the galley, where the crew had gathered with hushed expressions. "The captain wants to do something more," she whispered. "He says this moment deserves it." "What can we do?" another attendant asked. "It's not like we carry medals or flags on board." The lead's eyes flicked toward the cabin. "Sometimes it doesn't take much. Sometimes acknowledgement itself is enough." At row 13, Elena Cortez Raven sat motionless, her gaze still fastened on the fighters. She was aware of the stares, the reverence, the whispers swirling like wind around her. Yet inside, she felt the storm of her own history rising. Her hands, steady for decades in the cockpit, now trembled slightly on her knees. She hid them under the tray table, where no one could see. The businessman beside her leaned over carefully. "I don't mean to intrude," he said softly, "but why did you stop? Pilots like you don't just disappear." She turned her head, meeting his curious eyes. For a moment, she thought of brushing him off. But something in his earnestness disarmed her. "I didn't stop flying," she replied. Quietly, "I stopped carrying it. There's a difference." He frowned. "What do you mean?" Her gaze drifted back to the raptors. "The sky demands everything. Every ounce of focus, every sliver of courage. I gave it what I could, but eventually the cost catches up." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. In her silence was a shadow of lost comrades, of missions where return was not guaranteed, of decisions that weighed heavier than the aircraft themselves. The businessman nodded slowly, realizing her meaning. He didn't press further. Up front, the captain adjusted his headset. "Command, how long can the Raptors stay with us?" A voice answered. "They're burning extra fuel, but they're holding position. Their pilots requested to extend as long as possible. Direct orders from their wing commander. They're not leaving until you begin descent." The captain's throat tightened. He looked out at the fighter jets through his side window. "Copy that. And tell them. The entire aircraft thanks them for their honor." The Raptors tilted slightly in acknowledgement, as if the sky itself had nodded. Back in the cabin, whispers spread like wildfire. "They're not leaving until descent." Passengers pressed against windows, watching the twin Guardians. Phones lifted, snapping photos. Some had tears in their eyes and didn't understand why. The boy who had first spoken to Elena leaned over the armrest, his voice filled with awe. "They're staying for you. They're saluting you." She didn't answer at first. Her throat had closed around unspoken words. For years, she had avoided ceremonies, turned down interviews, and politely declined recognition. She told herself she wanted peace, anonymity, a life without the shadows of call signs and combat. But seeing two Raptors pilots who hadn't even been in training when she last flew holding formation for her, she felt a realization pierce through her carefully built silence. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about what Raven had represented, what Raven still meant to them. Her reflection in the glass window showed a woman older, lined with years, far removed from the fierce young aviator who once carved through the sky like fire. But behind her eyes, the spark remained. And they saw it too. The boy tugged on her sleeve. "Please," he said, "tell us something. A story. Anything." For the first time, she smiled faintly. Her lips curved with reluctance, but also with inevitability. "Once," she began, "we were escorting a convoy through hostile airspace. We were outnumbered 3-7. One wrong move, and we'd lose them all. I had to decide whether to turn back or cut through the canyon ahead. The canyon was suicide. Radar traps, narrow as a needle, but I chose it." The passengers leaned in. Even the businessman's hand stilled on his laptop. "What happened?" the boy whispered. Her eyes gleamed faintly with memory. "We made it. Every convoy plane landed safely. They called it reckless. They called it impossible. But in the end, not one pilot under my watch was lost." Gasps filled the cabin. A woman clasped her hands together. Someone muttered, "That was her mission?" The boy's grin stretched from ear to ear. "That's why they call you Raven, isn't it? Because you see paths no one else can." Her smile faded, replaced by something softer. "No, they called me Raven because I carried others' stories when they couldn't anymore." The cabin hushed at those words. Even the hum of the engines seemed distant against the weight of them. Up front, the captain keyed the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, the pilots outside have requested permission for a maneuver. Normally, this isn't something you'd see on a commercial flight, but under the circumstances, I think we should allow it." Every passenger pressed against their windows. The Raptors suddenly pulled closer, their wings slicing in unison. Then, as if choreographed, they tilted their wingtips sharply toward the airliner, dipping in perfect synchronization. It was a salute and aerial bow, reserved for those they honored. The entire cabin erupted in emotion. Gasps, tears, hands pressed against windows. Some passengers clapped, others simply sat in reverent silence, overwhelmed. Alina's chest constricted. She'd seen salutes like this before, but always from the cockpit, always for others, never for her. The boy whispered, voice trembling, "They're saluting you." Her eyes burned. She looked away, but not quickly enough to hide the moisture gathering there. She whispered, almost to herself, "No, they're saluting all of us who never came back." The businessman, moved beyond words, nodded solemnly. "And through you, they remember." For several long minutes, the Raptors held the salute, banking just slightly, wings gleaming against the horizon. Then, as the airliner prepared to enter controlled descent, they straightened, pulling ahead with a final graceful sweep. The cabin broke into applause again, thunderous this time, united. But Elena sat still, hands folded, eyes locked on the horizon where the Raptors disappeared. She realized then that her silence all these years had been both shield and prison. She had wanted to escape the weight of Raven, but Raven was never just hers. Raven belonged to every pilot who flew, every soldier who stood watch, every citizen who needed to believe the sky was guarded. And in that moment, she let it return to her, not as a burden, but as an inheritance. She turned to the boy, whose cheeks glowed with excitement. "Listen," she told him softly. "If you ever fly, if you ever chase the sky, remember it isn't about glory. It's about those you carry with you." He nodded fervently, as though committing her words to memory forever. The businessman closed his laptop entirely, something he never did mid-flight. He extended his hand. "It's an honor, Major Cortez, truly." For once, she accepted the handshake without hesitation. "Just Elena," she said. But even she knew now that no one would ever see her as just Elena again. The plane descended gradually, clouds rolling past the windows. Life would return to its ordinary rhythm soon, passengers retrieving bags, flight attendants reminding about seatbelts. But none aboard would ever forget this journey. And Elena Cortez, seat 13F, realized she would not forget either. The sky had saluted her, and in its echo, she had finally saluted back. The plane's descent was smooth, but the energy inside the cabin had shifted. It wasn't just altitude that had changed, it was time itself. For passengers, what had begun as a routine flight had transformed into a historic moment. For Elena Cortez, it was a reckoning. She pressed a hand lightly against the armrest, feeling the vibration of the engines through her fingers. The Raptor salute still echoed in her mind, a silent reminder that her past was not done with her, even if she had tried to walk away. Rows around her were alive with subdued chatter. Smartphones had not lowered. Many passengers were reviewing photos, videos, and even recording voice memos. There was an unspoken understanding. They had witnessed something extraordinary. "Do you think they'll meet her?" a young woman whispered to her companion. "The military, I mean. The real pilots?" Her companion nodded, eyes bright with anticipation. "They have to. She's a legend." Elena kept her gaze forward, calm in appearance, but inside her thoughts raced. She had left the skies, but the skies and now the ground still remembered her. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane approached controlled airspace. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady but imbued with gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're preparing to land. Please return to your seats and ensure seatbelts are fastened. And if I may add, thank you for witnessing something extraordinary today." The applause that followed was warm, full, and longer than before. Yet for Elena, it was the hum of anticipation outside the aircraft that mattered most. On the tarmac, ground personnel were already assembled. Air traffic controllers had alerted local military units. Word had spread quietly, but swiftly through the chain of command. Raven aboard. Confirmed. Flight ETA 5 minutes. The hangar doors were ready. A small contingent of officers waited, crisp in uniform, badges reflecting the morning sun. They had trained for ceremonial arrivals, but none of them had expected this. a living legend returning not for duty, but by choice. The Raptors that had escorted the flight began their withdrawal, banking gracefully before climbing into the open sky. The lead pilot gave one final wave of his wingtips slightly angled, almost imperceptible. Elena caught it and inclined her head in return. A final salute between skybound comrades. Passengers craned their necks as the jets disappeared into the horizon. Some cheered, some clapped, but the airliner's cabin was now saturated with a quiet sense of history. The boy beside Elena tugged her sleeve again. "They really respect you, don't they?" Elena smiled softly. "They do," she said, the words carrying the weight of years. "And you should too. Respect is earned, not demanded." The captain's voice returned over the intercom, this time with a gentler tone. "We'll be taxiing to the hangar. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is off. And, well, I'll let you discover what awaits on the ground." The plane touched down, tires kissing the runway with precise contact, the hum of friction vibrating through the fuselage. There was a collective intake of breath. Some passengers pressed their faces to the windows, wanting to glimpse the hangar that had been prepared for a hero. The jetways slowly moved into position. Military personnel waited in formal lines, respectful but vigilant, ready to ensure the safety of a high-profile arrival. Cameras were poised discreetly, drones hovering at distance, recording but careful not to interfere. As the plane taxied to the hangar, Elena exhaled softly. She had faced danger in the air, decisions that determined life or death, but nothing in those years had prepared her for this. Returning to public acknowledgement after decades of silence. The hangar doors opened as the plane reached the designated spot. Sunlight spilled inside, glinting off polished surfaces and rows of uniformed officers. The boy gasped. "Wow," he whispered. "It's like a movie set." Elena adjusted her posture, hands folded neatly on her lap. Her presence was calm, collected, commanding, though she did not step forward. The doors opened fully, revealing the organized spectacle awaiting her. Ground officers approached the aircraft, and the captain and first officer exchanged briefings with military liaisons. One senior officer stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but his posture impeccable. "Major Cortez," he said formally, standing at attention, "it is an honor to welcome you back in any capacity. Your service remains unmatched, and your legacy continues to inspire." Elena inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words without breaking her composed exterior. "Thank you," she said softly. "It is good to see that dedication continues in capable hands." Meanwhile, inside the cabin, passengers had begun whispering about the presence of military representatives, some craning to see the officers, and expecting some form of debrief or ceremonial exchange. Phones clicked again, not just in awe, but in the realization that they had witnessed history. The captain approached Elena, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "If you wish, we can arrange a private escort," he said. "No media, no interruptions, just the personnel who need to see you." She considered the offer. The pull of anonymity was strong, but the awareness that recognition had been unavoidable, the sky had already saluted her, was stronger. After a long pause, she nodded. "Then I'll go," she said, but quietly. The hangar doors opened wider, and a respectful silence settled as the aircraft doors lowered. Passengers clapped softly, some giving standing ovations. Even the boy had risen to his feet, waving. Elena looked at him and offered a faint smile, her hand lifting briefly. She stepped onto the tarmac, sunlight glinting off her hair, her posture impeccable. The senior officer stepped forward again, guiding her past the line of waiting personnel. Cameras clicked, but she did not pose. She did not offer a smile for effect. She walked deliberately, carrying the dignity that had always defined her. The ground crew and military staff formed a discreet corridor, allowing her passage without overt fanfare. Officers whispered greetings and brief acknowledgments, and she responded with a nod or a word, precise and calm. Inside her mind, Elena reflected on her years of absence. She had left because she believed the sky demanded sacrifices she no longer wanted to give. She had hidden, blending into ordinary life, carrying her past only in quiet memory. But the sky, and those who still flew it, refused to forget. Recognition had found her, persistent, inevitable, and inescapable. She realized then that her legacy was not hers alone to carry. It belonged to every pilot who trained under her shadow, every airman who had heard stories of Raven's maneuvers, every civilian who relied on the promise of guardians in the sky. It was not a burden. It was a duty she had long abandoned, now offered back to her in the form of acknowledgement. The captain's voice came again, this time over a secured channel. "Major Cortez, your discretion is respected. But know that those who escorted you have not forgotten. The sky remembers." Elena's lips pressed into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "And I remember it," she replied. "Always." Passengers disembarked eventually, still buzzing with excitement. Some approached to offer words of gratitude, carefully and politely. Others simply waved. The boy lingered, catching her gaze one last time, and she inclined her head. The hangar emptied gradually. The Raptors were gone, dispersed into the sky where legends belong. Military personnel and ground staff began standard procedures, but their eyes occasionally drifted to where she had walked, ensuring nothing, no detail, no acknowledgement was lost. For Elena Cortez, the experience was surreal. The skies had saluted her. The ground had recognized her. And the legacy she thought she had abandoned had found its way back. She paused at the edge of the tarmac, the wind brushing lightly against her face. For the first time in decades, she allowed herself a moment to breathe fully, not as Raven, the legend, not even as Elena Cortez, major in retirement, simply as herself. And in that breath, she understood something vital. The sky could honor her. The people could celebrate her. But she would always remain in control, choosing what to carry forward and what to leave behind. And that choice, more than any salute or applause, was the truest victory of all. The hangar doors closed behind her, muffling the distant hum of the departing jets. The crowd of passengers, military personnel, and curious staff slowly dissipated, leaving Elena Cortez alone with her thoughts. She lingered on the tarmac, letting the sunlight trace patterns across her face. For decades, she had sought solitude, traded the roar of engines for quiet streets, and the endless horizon for contained rooms. Yet today, the sky had not only found her, it had demanded acknowledgement. Inside her chest, the weight of her past was no longer a burden. The salute, the reverent formation, the applause it had reminded her that some legacies are too vast to ignore, too significant to leave unrecognized. A senior officer approached, his posture precise, but his eyes soft with respect. "Major Cortez, if you wish, there are officials and press waiting inside. They've been briefed on discretion. It is your decision whether you speak or decline." She considered it. Press conferences, interviews, accolades, she had long avoided them, believing her work spoke without ceremony. But the truth was more complex. Today, the acknowledgement of her peers, the quiet awe of passengers who had seen her without knowing why she mattered, had awakened something she had almost forgotten. "I will speak," she said finally, but only briefly. "I am not here to relive every mission. I am here to honor what remains in all of us who fly, who guard, and who remember." The officer nodded, understood. Passengers who had remained nearby, lingering after disembarking, turned to watch her walk toward the terminal. Their eyes were wide with curiosity, admiration, and reverence. For many, this moment would linger in memory forever, a legend, once myth, now tangible. Inside, the terminal had been prepared quietly. A small podium, a few microphones, and officers maintaining a respectful distance ensured she could address the public without chaos. Reporters who had caught word of the flight buzzed quietly, restrained by the presence of military protocol. Elena approached the podium, standing tall, calm, and collected. Her eyes scanned the room briefly before settling on the small crowd of civilians who had arrived with no media access but sheer curiosity. Children craned their necks. Adults shifted expectantly. Everyone wanted a glimpse of Raven. She inhaled softly. "Good morning," she began. Her voice was steady, measured, carrying the cadence of someone who had spent years issuing commands under impossible pressure. "I know some of you know me as Raven. Some of you may have heard stories, some only whispers. Today, I am here to say that those stories are real, but they are not mine alone. They belong to every pilot, every soldier, every person who has looked at the sky and believed they could protect what mattered most." A hush fell. Her words resonated far beyond their simplicity, carrying decades of unspoken courage. She paused, allowing the weight of her statement to settle. Cameras clicked, but she did not seek the lens. Her message was for those who understood, not for fleeting headlines. "I did not seek fame, and I do not claim heroism. My path was simply one choice among many, each demanding focus, discipline, and courage. If my journey inspires anyone, let it be because of the responsibility we all carry to ourselves, to others, and to the freedom of the skies above us." There was silence for a heartbeat, and respectful applause rippled through the room. Not the theatrical clamor of celebration, but measured, thoughtful acknowledgement. A young boy in the front, the same one who had first spoken her call sign on the flight, raised his hand timidly. "Miss Raven?" he asked. "Will you teach us someday about flying?" Elena crouched slightly, meeting his eyes. Flying is about more than the plane. It's about understanding, responsibility, and courage. If you carry those, you will always fly higher than you imagine. His grin lit the room. She straightened, knowing her words were not just for him. They were a gift to anyone willing to carry them forward. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of engines from incoming flights. She thought of the Raptors she had left behind moments ago. Their salute burned into memory. They had honored her, but also reminded her that the sky's guardianship was endless, beyond any one pilot. The officer beside her spoke quietly. "They want to know if you will join active ceremonies again. Military recognition, public events, commemorations." Elena considered. She had returned once under extraordinary circumstances, and the world had seen Raven again. But she understood that she could step forward without abandoning the life she had built. "I will appear," she said finally, "but selectively. Not for glory, not for spectacle, but to honor those who serve, past and present. That is enough." He nodded. "Understood, ma'am. Your discretion will be respected." Passers-by in the terminal whispered. Some recognized her immediately. Others did not, but curiosity had been piqued. A woman in uniform offered a subtle salute as Elena passed. She returned it with dignity, a gesture small but profound, bridging past and present. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, a mirror of the one that had witnessed her return. The sun glinted off distant clouds, casting light across the tarmac. For a moment, Elena paused and looked upward, feeling the familiar tug in her chest. She had feared recognition, feared that the weight of her legend would trap her. But standing there, seeing respect from both strangers and peers alike, she realized it was not a trap. It was continuity, a link between the past she had lived and the present she now navigated. Returning to her private vehicle, she felt the eyes of some passengers following her, but none intrusive, all respectful. A wave from a child, a nod from an adult, a fleeting smile from a fellow civilian, all small reminders of the impact a single life, lived fully, could create. As the car pulled away, Elena's gaze drifted once more skyward. High above, the sky remained infinite, a canvas for legends, known and yet to be born. She allowed herself a quiet thought. Raven remains. Not as myth, not as shadow, but as choice. The past and present intertwined seamlessly. The sky had recognized her. Ground had honored her. And now, she chose the balance between both worlds. Acknowledgement without surrender, presence without spectacle. Somewhere in her chest, she felt the unmistakable warmth of peace, the kind that only comes when one accepts the entirety of who they are, what they've done, and what they leave behind. She would always carry Raven, but she would carry Elena, too. And as the car merged with the flow of ordinary traffic, the city unfolding around her, she understood the truth of legacy. It is neither earned nor claimed. It is carried forward by those who remember and reflected in the sky above, in the hearts of strangers, in the quiet reverence of moments they will never forget. The horizon stretched endlessly before her, and for the first time in decades, Elena Cortez smiled fully, quietly, and without apology. The sky, the people, and her own choices had finally aligned. Raven's story had been restored, not as legend alone, but as living testament to courage, responsibility, and the weight and freedom of true flight.